Okay, so what we're going to do is look at the key species that indicate that it's an ancient woodland. I mean, if you look nationally, there's probably you see a list with about 100 species, which is not very practical, and actually for this part, this region, it's not actually that useful, really. Okay, so ancient woodland is usually defined as woodland that's persisted since 1600. There may have been changes during that period, but it's basically been woodland for around about 400 years is the key aspect. And of course, that means it's very diverse. A lot of species that take a long time to sort of to propagate and things like that can survive in those situations. And of course, most of our region is quite well urban, heavily industrialised, and there's been lots of changes to the environment in that time. And once you start looking at the species, we find that on this national list, there's probably maybe 2/3 just don't occur here, so they're not really very useful as ancient woodland indicators. And for a lot of the species that nationally used, we find that in this area, they're actually maybe planted or from the garden varieties of that species, or escaped over the garden wall into the nearby woodland. Things like primroses, everyone thinks, oh yeah, primrose, that's a woodland species. It's also in open areas, but on Merseyside, a big proportion are non-native. So it's difficult to actually say. You find that in the woodland, say, oh yeah, it's an indicator that this is ancient woodland. In Merseyside, it doesn't work quite as well, really. Same applies to things like wood spurge. I'll go through these individually and show the points, just to give you some basic sort of parameters on this, really. Wood spurge is usually the garden form, which is from Turkey originally, so that's the one you get on Merseyside, not the native form, which in the south of England, yeah, it's a great indicator of ancient woodland, but not around here. Same for giant bellflower, sweet violet. Again, around here, they're all escaped varieties, not of the native forms. Both sweet violet and common dog violet. And of course, for some of these as well, they're in more habitats than just woodland. So they're not very good to be indicated it's ancient woodland. And for some of the species, if you've got the native form, yeah, it's a great indicator. But around here, with things like bluebells, an awful lot of them hybrid rather than the native bluebell, and also the yellow archangel, which is the garden form, the variegated garden form with the silver on the leaves, argentatus. So it gets more complicated. You think naturally, oh yeah, it's a nice big long list, and if you've got those plants, it's going to be ancient woodland indicator. But around here, and with nature in general, there's always these exceptions to it, really. And then it's mostly either neutral or acidic, most of the soils around here. So all the typical plants you get in sort of lime or chalky areas are out of the equation in terms of Merseyside and most of this area. Okay, go to North Wales or North Lancashire, you can get things like early purple orchids, hair Paris, toothwort, common cowries, which in those areas are great indicators, but we just don't get them around here. So we're actually, from maybe 100, we're actually closing down to just a few species, really. It's quite a lot less. And one of the key things with this is that rather than just the odd plant of these particular species, as I mentioned, it's been around ancient woodland maybe been around 400 years. So even things that are very slow to spread should be in relatively large patches. So you're seeing large patches of bluebell or wood anemone or all these sort of key species. That's really the thing to look at if you've got a big spread of it, rather than just odd ones here and there. Because a lot of these plants are very specialist and they're very slow at spreading, which is why they need ancient woodland. They're not sort of animals with lots of seeds and can spread everywhere. The mechanism for reproduction is relatively slow, and so that's why they're indicators of continuous woodland for such a long period, really. As well as plants, there's lots of other ways you can try and work out that a place is an ancient woodland. So things like look at maps. If an area's been continuous for hundreds and hundreds of years, yeah, that's an ancient woodland. It's been going all that time. Historical sources can tell about an area as well. So you see, a lot of this project has been looking at that side of things, the history and all those sorts of things, the maps. And also various other groups of plants and animals can be useful for that. Again, it's a whole host of species that prefer these conditions. So around about 19 are what I feel are key species in this area. So it's a relatively small number compared to if you look at the national lists. And if you've got around about 10 of those in a woodland, the likelihood is that's going to be ancient woodland. That's sort of about the rough criteria on this. Sometimes beetles, mosses, lichens are often just as good or even better for working out whether somewhere is ancient woodland or not. So we've got sort of three groups. The 19 species are ones we can use, but there are a few provisos. As in nature, there's always these exceptions, really. And some can cross from ancient woodlands into some other habitats, but on Merseyside, it's principally ancient woodland species for these. Sometimes you get planted forms, but it's very difficult to work out whether something's a wild primrose or planted. You can probably work out to some extent if it's next to a garden or whatever, but it can be difficult in those sort of species. There's another 17 which can be supplementary, maybe on habitat or different forms or whatever, that you can't really sort of use those as an indicator species, but they'd help give you the idea of whether it is likely to be ancient woodland. We will provide this, if you don't need to take as many notes, I'll provide this as a PDF and a summary of the key ones, identification as well. And then there's 10 species that, if you look at the national list, yeah, they're ones for ancient woodland, but on Merseyside, they're not really usable. So I'll go through those in a bit more detail. This is the long list, but I'll go through them all. So that's the ones that are usable, 2 pages. So things like violets and the various grasses and things. The ones like, for example, primrose and lords and ladies and things are the ones that supplementary. They do occur in other habitats as well as ancient woodland, and some like Goldilocks is basically only found at Croxford, so it's not really very usable on a regional basis. There's things like brown strawberry, a whole range of other ones. I'll go through them in detail. And the ones you definitely can't use, things like wood spurge, yellow archangel, because they're not native ones that we get here. Toothware, hairy purple are in the limestone, but not here on Merseyside or the northwest generally. So let's have a look at some of these. This one's probably about the easiest to identify, ramsons. Smells of garlic. Wild garlic is the other name. I mean, I suppose there is one that you possibly could get confused with, which is three-cornered garlic, which is a garden thing, but in the ramsons or wild garlic, it's a very broad leaf, whereas it's much narrower in the three-cornered garlic. They both do smell of garlic, hence it's in the name, really. But I always feel it's sort of quite star-shaped, the flower of the ramsons, the alum. So they're both alliums, they're both in the same genus. What the three-cornered garlic is a garden escape, and it doesn't usually go too far away from gardens, but it is spreading. It's one that's quite increasing quite dramatically at the moment. But it's, you know, throughout Merseyside, there's quite a few gaps. It's not that widespread compared to further inland, Vice County 59. Bristol, South Liverpool, Moseley, St Helens, a few patches around Formby, but it's quite patchy in distribution, really.
What are the different colours got?
The different time periods. So green is recent records, blue is sort of 80s, 90s, open circles are 19th century records, so it's different time periods. But yeah, I'll always look for the green, that's the most recent records given it. Because when I show some other maps, this is from Dave Earls, Flora of South Lancashire, which is available. I'll give you resources at the end. But very noticeable broad leaves, and when you see it in a mass, you probably often smell it before you actually see this species. So that's fairly straightforward. You can sometimes get it in along streams and other slightly damp habitats, but principally, certainly in this region, it's most commonly associated with ancient woodland. So that's one that's fairly straightforward to do. Another one that's quite easy, at least when it's in flower. If you've just got the leaves, it can be very difficult. But these flowers are quite amazing. And the name Town Hall Clock is because the way it's like a sort of tower clock, so the clocks, as it were, on each side. And there's actually a flower on the top as well. So it's quite a strange structure, but it's quite tiny, only sort of 20, 30 centimetres usually. And most of the year, a few leaves, it's very difficult. It's similar in terms of the leaves to wood anemone, for example. But once it's in flower, which is usually sort of April, May, it's fairly distinct. But certainly on North Merseyside, it's quite sparse. Up through Scam, up to the Ribble Valley, it's more frequent, but a few spots around South Liverpool and a few dots. So it's relatively rare on Merseyside, really, this species. But if you do find it, it's very much an indicator that that's a good quality piece of ancient woodland, really. Yeah, that's quite interesting. It's sort of, it's a bit similar to wood anemone, but sort of slight bluish grey tinge to it, whereas it's a brighter green with anemone, which we'll see a little bit later. Again, it can be in slightly damp habitats along streams and things, but on Merseyside, it's pretty much restricted to ancient woodland. Whereas with all these things, there's often exceptions. You try to break the rules. So it's a bit more dissected, the leaves in wood anemone, and has a brighter, maybe yellowy green compared to the grey coloration in the muscatel. But if it's in flower, there's no doubt about it. A big carpet of that, you're going to say, yeah, that's going to be ancient woodland. You sometimes get pink forms of it as well. It can vary between, it's usually 5, 6, 7, but you can have as many as 9 petals on it. But that simple star shape is fairly distinctive. As with many of these things, sometimes people do plant them out, so that can confuse the situation. But if you've got a big carpet, it's obviously been there for years, because many of these things take many, many years to spread. So if you've got a patch as big as this room, it might be hundreds of years old. They are very, very slow in reproducing, really. You can see they can be quite pinky purple almost at times. So I mean, sometimes it looks two different plants, so it's white, or if it's this really dark colour, but it does vary. Most are white, but you do get some of the pinky purple ones. Just starting to come out now. It's between now and May is really the season for that, as it is for most of these species. There are a couple of exceptions, but the vast majority, April into May is your best time to go to work out most wood plants. That's the time to see them. As with some of these others, occasionally people can be planted, or sometimes in country parks and things, they can plant it out, and it's confusing then whether is it being planted as native. Sometimes it's unresolvable, but certainly around Merseyside, a good quality piece of ancient woodlands with a big carpet of that, yeah, it's going to be ancient woodland. And so quite sparse actually on Merseyside, a bit commoner elsewhere in Lancashire really, but if you find that, good chance it's going to be ancient woodland. We got into some a bit less easy to identify, things like remote sedge. Often with this one, going along the woodland path, it's on sort of either side, you often get quite a mass, especially if you've got a ditch or some sort of wettish woodland really is where you get this. Russia's sedge is not things that people are hard to identify, but this one is relatively straightforward. You get a mass of that along the path, but then look at an individual plant. The male flowers at the top there, then the females further down, but they always have these extremely long bracts. In a woodland situation, a sedge like that, with these massive long bracts on each of the flowers, it's going to be remote sedge character, remoter. It tends to like it a bit on the dampish side, so those are the sort of places along the stream edge, or maybe a pool in the woodland around the edge, or for some reason paths. You have to get a line of this along paths. You can see this as a city centre, but otherwise it's fairly widespread.
How tall is it normally?
It's 40, 50 centimetres, but it sprawls. I mean, it's often sprawling. It doesn't often grow very high, but it tends to in hummocks really, where it's damp in the woodland really is where you get that.
Can you get this one? Can you get this one out longer for the year? Not necessarily in flower.
Yeah, I mean it does. It's. I mean the seed heads stay for some time really. The tussocker's around basically almost all year really. It's easiest to identify in this early spring, early summer when you've got the fruits or the flowers really. But again, as with much natural history, once you've done several in flower, then you see it again not in flower. Oh yeah, I remember that now. Yeah, it's a gradual process, but this is very much sort of a woodland edge along a path or along a stream, rather than often right deep in the centre of the wood. Somewhat similar is wood sedge, but that's nowhere near as widespread. And it's structurally different. It doesn't have the long bracts for a start at each of the nodes where the female flowers are. And then the seed goes to like a beak on it, is the thing to notice with that. And then it has just a different look to it compared to the other one. It doesn't flop quite as much. It flops a little bit, but it's not in the same sort of tussocky shape, really. These beak fruits are called utricules, so that's the thing to look for. And again, it's often along the path edge or somewhere like that is where you tend to find this. And again, April, it can go on as long as July, really. But yeah, this April, May is the best time, really, for that. As with all sedges and things, the male is the top flower and then the females lower down. This one's fairly straightforward, and again, it's one that likes it really damp. So along a woodland stream or sort of a ditch or just a slightly hollow patch, you get this one, the opposite leaf golden saxifrage. Now in other parts of the country you can get the alternate leaves, but on this one you can see it's opposite each other. Whereas in the alternate, which you don't get round here, alternate, the opposite. But it's a good one to get here. You know, it's sort of around St Helens, a few in South Liverpool, but much of the area it's fairly widespread. But you go up towards the Ribble in central Lancashire, a bit damper. It's about one of the sort of thing is Merseyside is relatively dry, so especially on the Severn Coast compared to further inland. So the ones that like moisture tend to be further inland rather than closer to the coast. But it's only in some conditions, in some woodlands that have been there a long time, they're damp enough. Then have this one, but yeah, if you find this one on Merseyside in a damp woodland, yeah, it's going to be fairly ancient. But like all these things, it can occasionally be found along streams and things away from woodland. And with these things, there's always exceptions, but on Merseyside, that would be a good bet. It's ancient woodland. Now this one's unusual. Most of the others we're talking about flowering March, April, May. This can go on as late as August. It's also sometimes I know a few people have had this in their garden as a weed. So there's always exceptions, but no, most of Merseyside in the good woodlands, Enchanter's nightshade is a good example of an indicator species that shows it's going to be ancient woodland. The thing about that is the distinctive, even when it's not in flower, the arrangement of the opposite leaves are quite distinct to a point. But they're very sort of strange little white flowers there. And again, on Merseyside, there's a cluster, South Liverpool, Knowsley, but much commoner elsewhere in the district as you go inland a bit more. Very few around the coast. Yeah, so it's really late in the season. For the others, you can go sort of April, May and get most of them, but this one is a bit later in its flowering. Pignut, certainly on Merseyside, it's mostly in ancient woodland. You go to other parts of the country, say sort of further north in England or Scotland, then you get it in grassland where it's out in the open. So it can, it's one of these things that in this area it's in a damper woodland situation. Elsewhere it can be out in the open, but for here it's very much a plant of ancient woodland. Slightly later, May to June, typical umbel. It's only sort of 20-30 centimetres usually, relatively small. Once you get your eye on those leaves, those dissected leaves, sort of sprawling across the ground, often in a fairly bare area in the woodlands, often fairly close to paths and things, but fairly compact, you see that. If you scrabble on the ground, you can see the tuber that gives it its name, because of course these pigs used to snuffle around and feed on these. Again, it's relatively sparse on Merseyside, commoner further inland, but that's a good sign of, at least on this region on Merseyside, as being an ancient woodland indicator. Now we come to a problematical group, the bluebells. On Merseyside, probably in most woodlands, certainly on the western half of Merseyside, the vast majority are going to be hybrids. Most woodlands do have the native. I'm going to show you the map later and show you it is fairly distinct, widespread. But the key thing to look for really is the colouring. They're usually relatively dark, quite a dark blue, whereas the hybrids tend to be a bit paler. The other thing to look for is that it's parallel-sided, whereas those are more sort of bell type shape, really. They sort of go gradually to the lip and they sort of suddenly come out. The other thing to look for is the width of the leaves is a good thing as well. Even in the field, you can notice that relatively narrow, well, 7 to 15 millimetre compared to maybe 30 millimetre for the hybrids and Spanish bluebells. So it's much broader in the non-native, it's a much wider leaf. The other thing about native bluebell is that it tends to droop to one side, is the other thing to look for really. Whereas Spanish and the hybrids tend to be a bit more upright or maybe just a slight curve over really. The other thing to look for really is get a flower and look inside. In the native, it's a creamy anther and the pollen is sort of creamish coloured. In the hybrids, it tends to be a sort of a mix of yellowy, creamy, sort of bluish colours. And in the Spanish and other hybrids, it's sort of bluish, purplish blue. And also it varies where on the stem it actually joins on. So in a native one, it's relatively short and the creamy. And the hybrids starts a bit further down, sort of creamy, whereas in the Spanish and the other hybrids, it's bluish and it starts quite a long way down. So they're the things. So creamy, definitely blue, and the hybrid is in between. So they're the sort of main features to go for. What you're really looking for is the native bluebell. They're all flowering about the same time around about now is when all these are coming into flower. I mean, you can, if you're right next to a housing estate or gardens or something and people throw rubbish over the top, you can usually trace, but once you get your eye into a sea of blue and native, once you see it several times, you know it's native. Look how that feels. There's something about you know it's different, but these are really, really common. So native one, you've got a mass of nice blue, reasonably distributed. There's a few gaps, but it's fairly well widespread. But very much ancient woodlands are you going to get. But again, as with all these things, they can be planted. So can interrupt the distribution. But if you've got hundreds of yards of this, yeah, it's probably going to be ancient woodland. The others are of horticultural origin. The main one is what we call the garden bluebell, which is the hybrid between the native and the Spanish bluebell. For a long time, people used to think the Spanish bluebell was occasional in this country, but recent research has shown that probably we don't get the Spanish bluebell in this country. What we get looks like Spanish bluebell. There's this one called Hyacinthioides excelsior, or false Spanish bluebell, which has, I mean, the hybrid is sort of slightly bell shaped, and this one's really open in excelsior, very wide leaves, often quite pale, towards a paler edge, and that's widespread. So distribution is no help on this. It's looking at the shape, the colour, and especially the anthers, really. But yeah, once you get your eye in for native, yeah, that's good. But these are commonly around in many woodlands in the region.
Steve, can native bluebell be done without the flower, would you suggest, or not?
Yeah, if you measure the leaves, you can probably do it, but it's easiest to do. Well, but it's relatively short season. It's only a couple of months really they're going to be out. But yeah, I mean, if it's around between 7 and 15 millimeters, yeah, you've probably got native. If you're up 20, 30, you've got hybrids or the excelsior form. But yeah, you see it once in flower. Sorted.
I also ask, like, would you expect to see the hybrid in the same sort of carpet?
You can occasionally, yeah.
In other places?
I mean, when we have the flower project in Sandy Valley, and the main woodland block is solid native. Near the car park and sort of near gardens and things, you do get some of the hybrids.
Okay.
So yeah, even within the same woodland block, sometimes you do get both. Yeah, it is confusing.
Is the extent of the native decreasing over time? Or?
Probably not that quickly. I mean, where it does occur, it occurs often in vast amounts, and it seems to be fairly immune to sort of hybridizing. So where you have got it, it tends to do well and be relatively pure. Its peripheries, it might be doing that, but in the main blocks of bluebell, they got wood full of it. It seems to be doing okay and not hybridizing. But like any other species, I mean, those type of woodlands are being lost, and sometimes the management of a woodland can change these things, because even though they do flower, a lot of their spread is vegetatively by bulbs and that's various other ways like that, rather than from new seed. They might produce all these flowers, but probably 90% of the plants in the population are vegetative, not from seed. The same applies to many of these bulbs, that it's often spreading vegetatively, not actually by seed. But you can see, I mean, even on this, you just see how broad, it's really chunky and broad leaves, and that can be relatively narrow in the native. But yeah, it's the same whole bottom is that these IGs change. If we did this 5 years ago, we'd say, yep, Spanish bluebell. That seems it's not, it's this one, it's false Spanish bluebell, which is almost identical. But it's a hybrid, it's a cultivated form. Herring woodrush. I mean, the lazuli is the woodrush. You get some in open habitats, but this one is very much specialist woodland and rather thinly scattered really in the region. The key thing about it is each one is individual compared to the next one, which we'll see where it's all together. And as its name suggests, it is rather hairy. But it's relatively narrow leaves, only 3 to 4 mil. It's quite thin leaves in comparison to some of the others, but it'd be a good find that now. It's just fairly sparsely distributed in our region now. Whereas it's a bit commoner, not much, there's greater wood rush, and in comparison to the other, sort of they're quite clumped, the seed head there, and they're very broad, sort of yellowy green leaves, sort of 8 to 12 millimeters or a centimetre wide, and they tend to form clumps, often at path sides or sort of overhangs or that sort of place. It's also about twice the size, so for a plant that size, that size, once you get your eye, it does look quite different. It is hairy, but only along the edges of the leaf, whereas it was hairy. A lot of the plant is hairy. But yeah, again, it tends to be on slightly damper parts, and a stream edge or along the path, or where the sort of cliff comes down. It's nice and moist, is where you tend to get that. That's definitely an indicator of that species if you've got that. This is an awkward pair. Yellow pimpernel is definitely an indicator of ancient woodland. And the key thing to look for there is that really is that the leaves go to a definite point, is the key thing there. Also under the lens, you can see there's no glands on the leaves, whereas its close relative, and one that you can sometimes find in similar sort of areas, is creeping jelly, but it's quite round, the leaf on that. The flowers are a bit more sort of cut together, and if you look at the leaves under the lens, there's very little dots of glands on it. This is common as a garden plant as well as in the woodland, but an indicator is the yellow pimpernel, which slightly smaller flowers, but not a lot in it, but you sort of see it's almost star-shaped with a definite point, whereas in these are more clumped together and there's no real sign of going to a point. So there's a few features, but yeah, it tends to be quite foliose, really, a lot of leaves, whereas those are a bit more spaced, really, on yellow pimpernel. Grasses, there's lots of grasses in more open areas, but two specialist ones to look for in an ancient woodland situation are wood melic and wood millet. With the wood melic, key thing to look, it looks to me at my eye, it's looking for little tiny bits of rice spread over the sort of a fairly loose panicle, fairly widely spread. But if you look very closely at them, this thing, the gloom, that sticks up there, is parallel to the main part of the seed, but just that single long bloom is fairly distinctive in wood melic. But looking at the map, I don't see any green on Merseyside, so that would be quite a find now on Merseyside. It's declined quite dramatically, really. Trying to feel by sort of skim and then up the river, but it's definitely one on the decline, that. But a good ancient woodland should have that species. And again, it's fairly sort of May, June-ish, April, May, June mostly, really. But yeah, so it's distinctive. Have a close look, you see that single gloom. Whereas wood millet, as its name suggests, rather millet-like, typical millet type seed. And then the inflorescence, you sort of droop down, and then you've got sort of at the end there. And it's relatively tall, and the sort of way it droops down, once you get your eye in, that's fairly distinctive. Grasses aren't easy, but these are two very much indicators of ancient woodland. They're in the shade, they don't like open areas. They like that hundreds of years of consistent shade and woodland, really. But they're not massively widespread, but they are good indicator species. Dog's Mercury is fairly distinctive, both the leaves and the flowers. It's one of the earliest flowering, the certainly in flower by now. So it will go on to April, maybe into May. But again, with this one, if you see a good patch of it, it's indicating it's ancient woodland for the most part. But as with any of these, they can care outside of that. You can see the city centre and the Sefton coast, you rarely get it, but the Knowsley South Liverpool, St Helens, Woodlands, you get it. But male and females have slightly different flowers, but the plant itself is fairly distinctive. One of my favourites of the woodland ones is the wood sorrel. A bit clover-like in terms of the leaf. The flower is quite distinct, whitish with this sort of purpley, pinky veining. But the key thing to tell from clovers and other leaves that look similar is that notch. A bit clover-like with that sort of notch there. But very much woodlands, especially along streams or sometimes paths or under the base of a tree, somewhere like that is where you tend to find it. Look really nice, that pink purple veining. And often these sort of go upwards and sort of the leaves go down. But again, it's a relatively few on North Merseyside, really. Again, April, May is the time to go to find that. But that notch and the shape there is a bit clover-like, but not quite with sorrel. Sanicle is actually in the same family as white carrots and parsnips and things, but it's a woodland specialist. The flower is a typical Umbella apiaceae. It can be pinkish or it can be full white. Again, the leaves look like what we've seen, like with the muscatel, with the wood anemone, the sort of split leaves. Again, as with many of these, it's a bit on the moist side, perhaps. But it's very, very rare now on North Merseyside. Good place to go is on the Wirral. It's quite common at Dibbetsdale or along the Wirral, along the Ribble. Yeah, as you can see, there's only a few greens on there. It's definitely declining, so finding that is a good sign you've got a good quality ancient woodland. Now the speedwells, a lot of those are in more open areas, but this is a specialist of woodland. And there are a few things to look for. I find that often the leaves are relatively triangular in shape. They're also on long stalks. I'll show you later another speedwell that looks similar in terms of the flowers and things, but they don't have these long stalks. Everything about it really is elongated on the stalks, and then the flowers a long way along the stalk. And the other thing about it is that the hairs go all around the stem, all the way round. Relatively pale lilac blue flowers, usually only about 4 or 5 in the panicle at the end, really. So very much elongated. It's often like the edge of paths rather than right in the middle of the woodland. There are a few lookalikes. Jemanda Speedwell looks, at first glance, looks quite similar. Often brighter blue rather than the lilac, but some are, depending on the angle, sometimes some are a bit paler. But the thing is, there's no real long stems on the leaves. They're quite close, and they're only very, very short stalks on it. And often there's a lot more flowers. Sometimes you can have 10, 20 flowers in the cluster, whereas it's only so 4 or 5 maybe in your wood speedwell. Again, relatively sparse, really. Again, the same sort of areas where the woodland is good woodland. These ones you get in more open habitats along sort of grasslands or disturbed areas, as well as woodland. So you do into the edge of the woods, or a place like that, you can get these. The ivy speedwell is tiny. I mean, the flowers are only a couple of millimetres long, really, much paler usually. And the leaf is slightly different shape as well. Even on that shot, you can sort of see a hint of a triangle there. They're a bit more round, and that's the 3-lobe, supposedly ivy-like. So wood speedwell, good indicator, and again, April, May, June, maybe into July. Violets. The key with most of the violets is not to worry about the main petals, it's to look at the back. the spur that comes out the back. So in the early dog violet, it's darker than the petals, so dark purple, just sort of mid-purple. Whereas in the common dog violet, which you can't really use as an indicator species, even though it's quite common in woodlands, you get it in open areas as well, is to look at the whitish spur behind. So almost a question of ignoring that part of it, to just look at the spur, really. But the early dog violet it's an interesting one. I mean, for most of the woodland ones, sort of South Liverpool, Nose and St Helens, but if you're assessing them along the river, it's quite. But yeah, it's that purplish spur compared to the whitish.
The young dog violet have a hybrid. I feel like this is one.
They can hybridise, yes, and you can get various garden forms, especially the common dog violets. Yeah, so there's always exceptions, but usually if that's darker than that, but even that one can be slight sort of pinky purple tinge. But the key thing then is that that's lighter than that, whereas that's darker than that is the key feature really, rather than the true colour. It can vary slightly. We go on the colour of the spur really and the contrast. So they're the main ones. That if you've got those species, and especially if you've got maybe half of those in one woodland, you're going to say, oh, that's good quality ancient woodland. You've got maybe 8, 9, 10 of those species in a particular woodland. You get some woodlands like this one that's crofted that you might get oddities like rhododendrons and things. So you think, is that how much is that is really ancient or not? So the rare species that can help. So in many woodlands, you get, rather than the early, you're going to get common dog violet, very widespread. Yeah, we notice that palish spur. The other one is sweet violet, which does smell, hence the name. It's very early, that one, usually, sort of another couple of weeks, that will have gone over completely. And you'll just see then the leaves, which can get very big. Most violets are really tiny, but the sweet violet, which is common grown in gardens and things, is by sort of May, June, has absolutely massive leaves. But again, it's a spur, it's not, there's no pale spur, there's a leaf there. So it has a quite different look, really, compared to the other violets. But again, it just smells, so that's often a good way. These don't really have any violety smell. It's interesting on that one. In the 19th century, there's a lot of records of where it was native in the local woodlands. But nowadays, the vast majority of sweet violets are non-native gardenscapes. Native. Whereas this one can be native gardenscapes, gets it almost everywhere, common dog violet. So not really the main one for ancient woodland, but it does occur in ancient woodland as well.
So there's garden sweet violet looking.
No, it doesn't really look very different. No.
Right, interesting.
Possibly bred to be stronger smelling than the native one. But
Yeah.
wasn't
There's
that
no
great.
reason, because I know that.
No, and he also thought carrying purple and white forms as well.
I know there's big patch of unspeakable, but original.
Yeah, that's often the thing. You can't. I mean, what we believe now is that any sweet violet on North Merseyside now is non-native. That's of origin, not as a native species. This pair of species, the cuckoo-pointer lords and ladies, can be found in hedgerows and other places as well, so we can't really use it as ancient woodland. Certainly around much of Merseyside, you're more likely to find the Italian lords and ladies, Arum metallicum. The leaves on this are often bigger and bolder and often in clumps, whereas this tends to be just sort of one plant on its own. But the key thing is when it flowers, and it's quite a weird flower, it has this thing called a spadix, which in the native one is purple, whereas in the Italian one, it's sort of yellowy cream sort of colour, quite different. But once you start getting your eye into this one, you can get it in green, dark green, sort of yellow green, variegated forms. Most commonly close to habitation is where you get that, which is now spreading through various woodlands. So yeah, you look for the spadix to be certain, but smaller individual leaves, whereas often a big clump, often spread over meters. The Italian one is spreading quite rapidly in this area. But both are sort of not necessarily just woodland, they can be in other hedgerows, along lanes, that sort of place, hedge banks.
Can the native, Steve, can they do the same effect as the Italian?
Very, very rarely. So in those situations, I mean, that's a relatively small plant. These are much more robust. So usually you can work on that. But yeah, the only ultimate way to test is the spadix. But yeah, I mean, if you see this amount of variegation, probably going to be the Italian. It can occasionally happen in the native, but usually not. This pair, most Merseyside are more likely to see wild strawberry. A very good indicator of is wild strawberry, but it's very sparse now on Merseyside. But the key thing to look for, partly the leaves, quite glossy green leaves, it's got fruit on it, no doubt about it. Whereas it's sort of grey-green, slightly hairiness, gives a greyish tinge on that. Or if it's in flower, the key thing is that there's just about a gap, not a lot of a gap, whereas it's quite a wide gap between the petals in the orange strawberry. But if it's in fruit, there's no doubt about it. And of course, it's not an edible fruit in barren strawberry, hence the name. But yeah, change that very glossy, whereas that doesn't look glossy at all because of the hairs and the difference in the flowers. It also looks different structures. You can almost do a circle around that one, whereas it's sort of all disjointed in barren strawberry, really. Also, with the other thing you can look for is that it goes to maybe a slight point or just straight, whereas in barren strawberry there's a little notch there. So those are subtle things, but yeah, the leaves will help. Flowers, the best thing, but fruit, yeah, no doubt about it. But again, it can be in other habitats, so we can't really use it as Asian woodland, even though they can occur in those. This is a strange plant, Goldilocks buttercup. Really in this area, it's on Merseyside, it's restricted to Croxteth and nowhere else. But it's a weird plant because you've got three types of leaves. You've got these long linear ones, and sort of slightly dissected ones, and then a normal buttercup type one. So you can see the various leaf types. It's quite a weird looking thing, really. And the key thing is the flower usually, again, sort of April, Mayish time. And that's quite typical. Sometimes has no petals, sometimes has one or two, sometimes three, sometimes 4 or 5. It can vary quite dramatically. But this is when botanists look at this species and try to look at the genetics and the variation within this, they reckon there might be as much as 300 microspecies, which is a similar number to dandelion. But the reason we can't really use it as an ancient woodland indicator is that it's only one site here. There's another one, probably an introduction at Churchtown, Southport for this. But
do you know much about like the distribution in the rest of Lancashire?
Yeah.
Found it at church,
yeah, there's a few sort of, there's not very many sites, and then the Ribble Valley is the main one. It used to be much more frequent, but yeah, it's restricted. Whereas naturally, it's quite red, you got a big gap. Yeah, it is quite an unusual distribution now.
Is there a chance it's under recorded because it's misidentified?
Possibly, but having all those three types of leaves together, it's weird. It does look like a weird buttercup. So
Just the like coastal effects, like I think everything on the extreme west seems to be. I was wondering if it's something to do with the weird climate you get in Liverpool.
Don't know. I mean, It was very widespread, sort of Knowsley, sort of Croxter sort of area. There's a cluster of sort of records there, and then it's strange, but then there's all these gaps with nothing. Very strange. But not one interesting plant, but not really one you can use as ancient woodland. In many woodlands, you can get lesser sand down, but you can't say if you find that, yeah, it's ancient woodland. Very common in ancient woodland, but not really an indicator. And same for bugle, common in ancient woodlands, but you also get on the hedgerows and other habitats, paths and things. So in April, we're going to go to Sankey Valley, and these two species we get in the ancient woodland there, but they're not indicators that it is ancient woodland. And the same applies to many of these, really. In many of the national lists and things, these are down as ancient woodland indicators, but for this area, not really relevant. Goldenrod, often planted in other habitats, so you can't really use it. Primroses, possibly as much as half of the woodland primroses here are planted or of garden origin. You can't really use it to indicate ancient woodland. Same for woodruff, often planted, can be in other habitats as well. Giant bellflower cross, there's some lovely specimens in the woodland there, but probably of garden origin. Very showy, but in the south of England, yeah, you can use that, it's great, it's native there, but here it's a garden form. Three nerves sand wet, told because of the three veins through the leaf there. The other thing about this species is that the sepals, yeah, the green and white sepals are much, much bigger than the petals in this. It tends to sprawl quite a bit, really. But again, it's a lot is in woodland, but also other habitats as well. Certainly at Sankey Valley, where we'll go on the field trip as well, but not truly indicative of ancient woodland. On all the lists for South England, this one is one we'd use as an indicator, but on Merseyside, it's all garden form, Turkish wood spurge. Quite much taller and more floriferous, but not one we can use around here. These two are a bit difficult. They look quite similar, long panicles. The thing with false brome is that very cylindrical, almost like a cigar or something. Very much a cylinder and relatively broad leaves on it. Key thing about hairy brome is that is the hairiness around the ligule and around the. It's quite raggedy ligule and very soft, downy hairs. But again, this one looks like it's gone from Merseyside. We'll records for that, so that would be a nice find. Whereas that is much more frequent. Grasses are difficult, and in a woodland situation, it's difficult to. There are a few specialists like these, but grasses are generally not easy to have as indicators. Really, wood meadow grass can be in more open habitats, but the powers are difficult. It's really specialist group, really, to be honest. Giant fescue, the thing is, there's sort of hairball knees, but the key thing is these auricles. You see, like red projections at the base. Again, woodlands as well as hedges and streams and other places as well, so not really useful. Same applies late fern, hard fern, wood horsetail. They can be in ancient woodlands, but not necessarily. They can be in other more open, wet habitats. Tin spiked wood sedge, possibly extinct on Merseyside, but that would be a nice find should we ever find it. It used to be a carrot speak in Halewood. So that's some of the key species and the whys and wherefores of whether you can use it as an indicator species. We'll provide a PDF of all those species with flower and show you what the things to look for. But the other resources you can use when you're looking at the flowers, my favourite to take into the field is the VSBI's British and Irish Wildflowers. The reason I like it, it's small, in your pocket. But I mean, the key things, for example, the violets and things, it shows you the features nicely. It's a bit small. I definitely need to put the glasses on to use this, but that's the starting guide. That's the best, really.
Is it photographic, Steve? Or
Yes, photos. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it shows you all the features you need side by
And it's a
side.
BSBI one.
Yeah, it's in the wild guide series.
Oh, the wild guys.
Yeah, they're good, they're all good. But yeah, I mean, all the violets and things it does, and all the grasses, it does grasses as well, which is usual. You know, just the common ones, I mean, there's probably about 4,000 species now known in Britain, so no book can do all that, but everything you're likely to find, this one does it, and it's only about £8. It's the cheapest one as well. Lots of photographic guides, but it doesn't do grasses, the salmon, harps, wildflowers. It's my second favourite. Yeah, it's photographs. But the good thing about this is the maps are based on the BSBI maps, so they're really up-to-date maps on these. So that's my second best. I think it's a bit more bulky. I don't want to pass these around. And then the third one, he uses Colin's wildflower guide. The problem with this one, it's fairly comprehensive, but
It's heavy.
it is very. Like it does do grasses, sedges, etc. But yeah, I mean it's always compromised how much you go into the field. I mean some of these are now Simon Harper is available as a ebook, so some of them are, but not all of them. So yeah, I mean that's in the future. I might be to just have a tablet and go out and field with that rather than a whole load of books. I mean, your Ultimus is a Stasis Flora, but that's even bigger again. So, I mean, it's always a compromise on these things. What resources are?
You wouldn't want to bog your hair and carry it.
No, exactly. It's yeah. I mean, I have two copies. I have one for home and one to in the field, which so that's the way. Some of the great resources. Anything you really want to know about plants really is BSBI's Plant Atlas 2020. Okay, it's a bit nearly 5 years out of date now, but you know, things are always the day after they're published, they're always out of date. But it's great if you want to know whether things it's in where the distribution for nearly 3,000 plants it does. Plant Atlas 2020. But also it's useful in that it gives you a basic introduction. It also gives the conservation levels and things like that, the trends, phenology, so when is it in flower, when is it in leaf, altitude, not particularly useful unless you're in the mountains. But also you can actually change it from 10 kilometres square to 2 kilometres square, so you can zoom in much closer, and also sort of there's further reading on that species. So that's, I found I use that constantly. On a smaller scale is the FSC ancient woodland indicator plants, but that's basically for the whole country. And so, I mean, yes, Dr. Mercury, but we don't get Haired Paris. The yellow archangel, they give us a native one, not the silver very big form that we get around here. The wood spurge is the native one, not the Turkish one that we get around here. So it's useful in a way, but it's trying to cover the whole country with maybe a slightly South of England bias. But useful because it's small and falls out, so that's a nice little guide. There's a whole swathe of publications on ancient woodland and the species you need for indications. And all various, I mean, there's a good one on British wildlife, it was quite a while ago, but there's a whole literature on ancient woodland. But we will provide this as a PDF and also do a summary of the photographs now. On a more local basis, the North West Naturalists Union have Daybell's Flora of South Lancashire, Wales County 59. Slightly problematical. You really almost need a copy of Stace to work out which family you're trying to deal with. But it is comprehensive maps that we use from this. So, but it's not the easiest to use, but there's great information, photographs on the maps. They're in there really. I think that's the summary really. As I say, in April we'll do a field one, so if anyone can make that, we'll go out and see most of those species in the field at Sankey Valley, which has the vast majority of those. Any questions on that?
On the FSC chart, obviously notice small leaf line on Wych Elm.
Yeah.
I think we've got a few golf courses certainly where I've seen like that regenerating, but is it too punchy to say that that would be an indicator?
Trees are certainly on Merseyside. It's I mean, there's so many planted that to try and work out that's a native small leaf line is so difficult. So in theory, it's nice. Yeah, there's all these tree species that are indicators, but the vast majority of woodlands in Merseyside have been planted to some extent at some stage. So it's very difficult to use those sort of things. Even as we see with some of the wildflowers, even it's difficult, and even more so because trees are so widely planted and often the records aren't known. I mean, if you have, say, if we say up in North Lancashire or whatever, around sort of Arnside or something like that, a small leaf line, yes, you'd say, yeah, that's native, but on Merseyside, not really usable.
About sea, like that means we definitely would say that's an ancient woodland. They're about sea, like north.
Yeah, that sort of area, yeah, on the limestone and things like that, yeah. But yeah, I mean, there's hardly any sort of woody species on Merseyside you could use. Because there's so much planting really. Yes, I mean, and even sort of some what can be ancient woodland might have been cut, say, 200, 300 years ago. So they did become open, but then tree growth has reoccurred. So often with these sort of sites, they're often, what remains is often little tiny screwy things that have actually been tree covered to be part of that 300 or 400 years.
What I understand is that these things can remain in the soil even if there's no trees.
Yeah.
It's the history of it, not the current status of it.
And that sort of links back to the slow reproduction of many of these species. I mean, if you think about sort of all the sort of bluebell woods in parts of Britain, which is just a swathe, it often would take 300-400 years to produce that of continuous forest woodland colour to get to that. And it's mostly reproduction by vegetative means, not by flowers. Despite the massive flowers, the seeds don't produce many of the plants for many of these species. That's why most of these species are indicators of ancient woodlands, because of their reproduction are relatively slow. So they've needed those hundreds of years to actually sort of reproduce to a reasonable extent.
And do we have any annuals in these trees?
Any?
Annuals planned?
No.
That's all, yeah.
Not as ancient woodland indicated. There's a few in Britain, but not many really. It's
One of the things that ecology is so plant-based, like describing habitats, right? So it's the default.
yeah, I mean, there's once you start going to some of the fungi and those insect-rooted vertebrates, mosses, lichens, there's a lot of sway to those that are indicators, but that's even more of a because you got hundreds of thousands of species. Some of those that it is difficult. But I mean, if you get say 8 or 9 of those 19, there's a good likelihood that's going to be ancient woodland. That's sort of the key thing from this really. Criteria.
For ancient woodland to get sort of formalised then, could you do that strictly as an ecologist? Could you do that like it's purely based on our indicated plant species, or would you need other technical discipline input?
On the inventory, it's a combination.
Yeah.
It's a lot of maps. That's a good starting point. The place has been on the maps back to the 17th century or whatever as woodland, yeah, there's no doubt about it. But yes, I mean, you can't use plants just on its own, really. It's if you do, there's a combination of other things, really.
There's quite a lot of detective work that's been going on to make the map.
I mean, on the map, I mean, it's lots of small little woodlands is the thing. We know most of the major ones are known, like Croxley, Moseley, Speak Hall, those sort of places are well known.
Royal Hunting Grounds.
Some of them are, yeah, or large scale, but there's lots of tiny fragments of woodland spots around Merseyside, which may well be ancient woodland, but some are hard access, some are tiny bits within the fields and lots of things, and no one's really surveyed them to a big extent. I'm not sure